That day, Jane awoke with a heavy sense of foreboding. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to figure out where the inexplicable anxiety came from. A letter from the notary had arrived a week ago, a dry, official notice about the need to be present for the reading of her father-in-law's will. Even after her divorce from Mark, he had continued to treat her like a daughter. He called frequently, took an interest in her affairs, and offered advice. His sudden death had been a heavy blow. Jane slowly got out of bed and walked to the window. The spring morning was cloudy, with dense grey clouds hanging low over the city as if heralding a storm. She ran her hand over the cold glass, leaving a damp trail with her trembling fingers. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "I can handle it. I just have to get through today." In the bathroom, Jane spent a long time observing her reflection. Despite a sleepless night, she looked composed. An impeccable formal suit, subtle makeup, and her hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Only her eyes held an anxiety that no mask of confidence could hide. The cab arrived promptly. The driver, an older man with a kind face, nodded with understanding when she gave the address of the law office. "Don't you worry, dear," he said, noticing her tense gaze in the rearview mirror. "Everything will work out." Jane offered a weak smile in response. "I wish it were that easy." 3 years ago, she had left her husband after discovering his affair with a young secretary. The divorce was difficult. Her former mother-in-law, Barbara, had never forgiven her for leaving her beloved son. The car stopped in front of an old mansion in the heart of the city. Jane paid the fare and, after taking a deep breath, walked toward the imposing oak door. Every step felt heavy, as if her legs were made of lead. The law office waiting room was filled with an oppressive silence. The receptionist, a young woman with a sleek nameplate reading Gwen, smiled at her. "Good morning. Here to see Mr. Bruce. Please go right in. They're waiting for you." Jane's heart skipped a beat. This meant she wasn't the first to arrive. Who was behind that door? Though deep down she already suspected. The office door opened soundlessly. Jane stood motionless in the doorway, feeling the floor disappear from under her feet. In the deep leather armchairs sat 3 people: her ex-husband Mark, his new partner whose pregnant belly was visibly showing, and her former mother-in-law, a triumphant smile on her lips. "Come in, Jane," the notary's voice broke her stupor. Mr. Bruce, a man with silver hair and a sharp gaze, gestured to an empty chair. Jane slowly sat on the edge of the seat, avoiding looking at the others. "Now that we're all here, we can proceed with the reading of the will," the notary said, pulling a document from a folder. The will was drafted by John Davis a month before his death. "It is notarized by me and fully complies with the law." A shiver ran down Jane's spine. The last time she saw her father-in-law was 2 months ago. He had seemed thoughtful, talking a lot about life and how important it was to be able to forgive. Now those words took on new meaning. "I, John Davis," the notary began to read, "of sound mind and with full clarity, hereby draft this last will and testament." Jane closed her eyes. The image of her father-in-law came to mind. The kind wrinkles around his eyes, his wise smile. How many times had he told her, "Don't worry, my girl, time will put everything in its place." "All of my assets," the notary continued, "including the downtown apartment, the country house, bank accounts, and my stake in the company, I leave to—" An absolute silence fell over the office. Jane felt her former mother-in-law's triumphant gaze and heard the nervous tapping of Mark's foot. His new partner, Brenda, was stroking her belly with a smug smile. "My daughter-in-law." A bomb seemed to explode in the room. Barbara shot to her feet. "What? This must be a mistake. This can't be." Mark turned pale. Brenda blinked in confusion, not understanding what was happening. "There is no mistake," the notary replied calmly. "The will has been drafted in accordance with the law. Please, let me continue." Jane remained seated, stunned by the news. She couldn't believe what was happening. Had her father-in-law made a condition? The notary raised a hand, calling for silence. "On the condition that Jane assumes leadership of the company and continues the projects I started." "This is absurd." Barbara let out a nervous laugh. She knows nothing about construction. Mark worked with his father for 10 years. He knows every project. Jane slowly turned toward her former mother-in-law. A wave of fury rose in her, not for herself, but for her father-in-law, whom they were now trying to portray as a senile old man. "You're mistaken, Barbara." Her voice was firm and calm. "I worked at the company as the chief economist for 5 years. John personally taught me every aspect of management, and every major contract in the last 3 years went through my hands, even after the divorce." Mark flinched as if slapped. He had thought his father only felt pity for his former daughter-in-law. "There's something else," the notary said, pulling out a second envelope, a personal letter for Jane. She took the envelope with trembling hands. On the white sheet, she recognized the familiar handwriting. "My dear girl, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. Forgive me for not having spoken to you about my decision sooner. I have been watching both you and Mark closely. You have turned out to be stronger, wiser. When everything fell apart, you didn't give up. You didn't seek revenge. You kept working, learning, growing. But my son, he chose the easy path. He thought everything would be handed to him without effort. It's my fault. His mother and I spoiled him too much. Perhaps this will serve as a lesson for him." Jane looked up from the letter. Mark was hunched over, his head down. Brenda was nervously fidgeting with the edge of her blouse, and her former mother-in-law's gaze held such hatred that Jane couldn't help but shudder. "I'll contest this will," Barbara exclaimed, jumping to her feet. "My husband was not in his right mind. He was tricked." "Please, sit down," the notary said firmly. "The will was drafted in the presence of witnesses. John passed a medical examination before signing. All documents are in order." Jane folded the letter and put it in her purse. A strange sense of calm came over her. Now she understood. Her father-in-law had been preparing her for this all along, all those conversations about business, his advice, his silent support. "Well," Jane said, standing and straightening her shoulders, "I think we all need some time to process this. I propose we meet in a week at the company office to discuss the current projects and future work." She spoke calmly and confidently, even though her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Mark was looking at her with a new expression. It was a mix of surprise and respect. Mr. Bruce addressed the notary. "When can I assume my duties?" "As of today, if you wish. All necessary documents are ready." Jane nodded and walked toward the exit. Before she crossed the threshold, she turned back. "Oh, and Barbara, remember when you said I wasn't worthy of the Davis name?" She paused, letting the words sink in. "It seems John thought differently." In the hallway, Jane leaned her back against the wall, trying to control the trembling in her legs. Only now was she beginning to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. The company, hundreds of employees, dozens of projects, an enormous responsibility. "Jane, wait!" Mark's voice reached her as she was at the exit. She turned slowly. Her ex-husband looked disoriented, as if he had aged several years in a matter of minutes. "Why are you running after me?" she asked quietly. "Are you afraid I'll sell the company and leave you without a job?" "No, Mark stammered, running a hand through his hair. "I just wanted to say, my father was right. You really are strong, and I—" Jane shook her head. "No, Mark, this isn't the time for that conversation." Outside, a fine drizzle was falling over the city. Jane pulled out her phone to call a cab, but her fingers were shaking. Her vision was blurred. Was it the rain or unwanted tears? "Oh, for goodness sake," she muttered, trying to compose herself. "Jane?" A familiar voice called her name. It was Mr. Bruce, approaching with an umbrella. "I'm sorry, but I have to give you something." He handed her a small envelope. "John asked me to give this to you separately after you left." Jane took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a key and a note. "It's for the office. In the safe, you'll find everything you need to know. The code is your date of birth. And I believe in you, my girl." "You can use my car," the notary offered. "My driver will take you to the office." Jane nodded gratefully. At that moment, she really shouldn't have been behind the wheel. Too many emotions, too many thoughts. In the spacious black car, everything was calm and quiet. The city passed by the tinted windows like a backdrop from some strange play. Jane took out her father-in-law's letter and read it one more time. "You know," he had written, "I always dreamed of having a daughter. When Mark introduced you, I knew it immediately. Here she is, my smart, honest, strong-willed girl. It's a shame my son wasn't worthy of you." The car stopped in front of a skyscraper with the Davis Construction logo. Jane went up to the top floor. A long hallway covered with a soft carpet seemed endless. How many times had she walked here with folders of documents, rushing to a meeting? And now she was walking as the owner of the place. Her father-in-law's office greeted her with silence and a faint scent of leather and wood. Everything was the same: the enormous desk by the window, the bookshelves lining the walls, the comfortable chairs for visitors. The only thing missing was the photos on the desk. The stern-looking Barbara had taken them. Jane walked over to the safe hidden behind a painting. Her fingers trembled as she entered the code. Inside was a thick folder marked "Strictly Confidential" and another envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph, her and John Davis at some corporate event. They were both laughing, and he had his arm around her shoulder. Jane carefully placed the photo on the desk and opened the folder. Inside were documents that revealed the true state of the company, something even Mark didn't know. It turned out that for the last 2 years, John had been preparing a major restructuring of the business. He planned to take the company to an international level, open a new division, and according to the notes in the margins, he saw Jane at the head of the entire process. "Only you can see this through," said the attached note. "You have everything you need: knowledge, experience, character, and most importantly, the ability to see people for who they truly are. Don't let anyone deter you from this path." Jane sank slowly into her father-in-law's chair. It was surprisingly comfortable, as if it had been made for her. There was a gentle knock on the door. John's assistant, Nancy, who had worked at the company for over 10 years, appeared in the doorway. "Jane, sorry, but the department heads have gathered. They heard about the will and want to speak with you." Jane took a deep breath. Well, sooner or later this moment had to come. She straightened her suit and stood up. "Invite them to the conference room. We'll start in 5 minutes." Nancy nodded and disappeared. Jane walked to the window, looking out at the city from the 20th floor. Down below, construction was beginning: residential complexes, shopping centres, office buildings. The conference room buzzed like a stirred beehive. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on Jane when she entered. All the key figures of the company were there: the chief engineer, the financial director, the project managers. Many still remembered her as the economist. "Good afternoon, colleagues." Her voice was firm and confident. "I assume you are aware of John's decision. Yes, it was unexpected for all of us, but I propose we put emotions aside and talk about company matters." "And what is there to discuss?" A loud voice from Andrew Freeman, the head of the construction department, rang out. "No offence, Jane, but a construction company should be led by a builder, not an economist." A murmur of approval went through the room. Jane calmly placed a folder of documents on the table. "An interesting observation, Andrew," she smiled. "Tell me, are you aware that the Suncoast project is on the verge of collapse, that the contractor inflated the budget by 30%, and that delivery deadlines are at risk?" Silence fell in the room. Andrew turned pale. "How do you know that?" "John left me a full report on the company's situation, including details that only a few people knew." Jane's gaze swept the room. "And you know what else? He was preparing major changes. I have a restructuring plan on my desk that will take the company to a new level." She took several documents from the folder. "I propose you review it, and then we'll discuss what each of you can contribute to the company." The rustle of papers filled the room. Jane watched as the expressions of the directors changed as they read. Surprise, skepticism, respect. John's plan was truly impressive. This is revolutionary," murmured Al, the chief engineer. "These technologies, this scale." "Exactly," Jane nodded. and notice that everything has been calculated in detail: finances, courses, deadlines. John worked on this for 2 years, and I intend to make his vision a reality. But how? Someone asked from the back of the room. The changes are enormous. Together, Jane replied simply. Each person in this room has their strengths. My job is to bring them together and direct them in the right direction. And what about the current projects? Asked Sabrina, the company's lead lawyer. They remain our priority. Jane opened the next document. What's more, I propose we create a crisis group for the Sun Coast project. She looked at Andrew, who was still silent. And you will lead it. Who knows the ins and outs of the project better than you? Andrew straightened, and a flicker of surprise appeared in his gaze. You trust me? I trust professionals, Jane said firmly, and I don't hold grudges for harsh words. The important thing is the result. A murmur of approval ran through the room. The first obstacle had been overcome. And there's another important point. Jane took out the last document. Here is a list of young talents that John planned to promote. I've reviewed their files. They're impressive. I propose we give them a chance. Gwen, the head of human resources, leaned forward with interest. Those are the kids who proposed the new project management system. Exactly, and he saw their potential. I agree. We need fresh ideas and a modern approach. At that moment, the conference room door burst open. In the doorway stood Mark, pale and dishevelled. Sorry I'm late, he said in a hoarse voice. Can I join? A tense silence fell over the room. Everyone knew about their divorce. News travelled fast in the company. Jane felt dozens of curious stares on her. Of course, Mark. She gestured to an empty seat. We're just discussing the company's development plans. He sat down silently and took the documents they offered him. Jane continued the presentation, trying not to look at him, but she noticed from the corner of her eye how he studied the papers carefully and took notes. Any questions, proposals? She asked when she finished. I have a proposal. Mark's voice broke the silence. Everyone looked at him in surprise. I'd like to lead the contractor management area. We need someone who knows all the ins and outs of the process. Jane watched him closely. There was no arrogance in his eyes, only a professional attitude and something akin to regret. All right, she agreed after a brief pause. Prepare a detailed work plan. We'll discuss it tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you, Mark replied quietly. The meeting continued for another hour. The directors became increasingly involved, offering ideas and debating. Jane skillfully guided the discussion, observing who was truly concerned about the company and who was just pretending. That's enough for today, she concluded. By tomorrow, I expect a report from each of you on current projects and proposals for restructuring. When everyone began to leave, Mark stayed by the door. Jane, can I talk to you for a moment? I'm listening. She gathered her papers without looking up. I just wanted to say... Mark hesitated. My father was right. You are the best person for this job. He paused before continuing. And I ruined everything. Not just in our family, but at the company too. Jane looked up. Mark stood with his shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the confident, handsome man she had once fallen in love with. You know, she said slowly, your father used to say that business is like life. The important thing is to recognize your mistakes in time and start over. Do you think I can do it? That's up to you, she replied. He headed for the exit. See you tomorrow, Mark. In the reception area, Nancy was waiting for Jane with a pile of documents. Jane, here are some urgent papers to sign, and also... She stopped. Barbara called. She said she's going to sue. Let her, Jane replied calmly. All the documents are in order. Tell me, what's the mood in the company? There's a lot of buzz, of course, but after the meeting many people are on your side, especially the younger ones. They've been waiting for a change for a long time. Jane nodded. She felt it herself. The team was on her side. What John had said wasn't in vain. If you want to know a company, ask the employees, not the bosses. Nancy, please arrange a meeting with the lawyers for tomorrow and prepare a list of all current projects for me. The evening was falling over the city. Jane stood by the panoramic window of her office, watching the lights turn on. The first day in her new position was coming to an end. So much had happened. Her head was spinning. The phone vibrated softly, a message from Brenda. "We need to talk. It's important." Jane smiled wryly. Mark's fiancée wanted to discuss her future at the company, or perhaps scare her with the pregnancy, as if to say that the future father was not very sure of himself. "All right, tomorrow at 3 p.m. in my office," she replied briefly. The clock showed 9 p.m. Time to go home. Tomorrow would be a difficult day. Jane took one last look at the photo with John Davis. "I won't let you down, Dad," she said in a low voice. "I promise." The morning began with an unexpected surprise. A group of young professionals were already waiting for her in the reception area with a presentation of new projects. Their eyes shone with enthusiasm, and the ideas turned out to be genuinely fresh and interesting. "We've been wanting to present these developments for a long time," Patrick, the lead engineer, explained. "But no one paid much attention to us before." "Now you'll be heard," Jane smiled. "Prepare the detailed calculations. We'll form a working group." After they left, Mark appeared with a folder of documents. He looked composed and serious. It was clear he had worked all night on the plan. "Here you go. I've reviewed all the problematic contracts. I have some ideas for the situation." Jane looked through the papers. The analysis was accurate. The proposals were reasonable. "Not bad," she said, looking up from the documents. "Especially the part about optimizing supplies. Start implementing it." Mark's voice held surprise. "You're not even going to double-check it?" "Why? You know more about this field than anyone. And besides—" She hesitated. "Your father always said, trust people, but verify the results." Mark nodded and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned. "You know, I understand now why my father chose you. You don't just lead a team." Jane remained silent. What was there to say? Her ex-husband's revelation came several years too late. At 3 o'clock, as arranged, Brenda appeared. She was flustered, not at all as confident as she had been yesterday at the notary's office. "Sit down," Jane said, gesturing to the chair. "I'm listening." Brenda fidgeted with the strap of her bag. "I came to apologize for my behavior yesterday, and also, I think you should know the truth." Jane raised an eyebrow. "What truth?" "Mark. He doesn't love me. He never did. He just wanted to hurt you. And then," she caressed her belly, "then the baby came, and everything got complicated." "And why are you telling me this?" Jane asked calmly. "Because I see that he has changed after yesterday. He worked all night on the documents. He was talking about the company, about how wrong he was." Brenda sighed. "He still loves you." Jane shook her head. "That doesn't matter. The past is in the past. What matters now is something else. Will he be able to handle his new responsibilities? Will he be able to justify the trust?" "And how will you have a baby?" Brenda interrupted softly. "That's the main thing. The rest is just work." Brenda stood up, holding back tears. "You're not what I thought you were." After Brenda left, Jane sat motionless for a long time. It was strange, but the conversation had caused her neither pain nor jealousy, just a slight sadness for what could have been, but wasn't. The sound of the phone brought her back to reality. It was the chief engineer. "Jane, here at the Sun Coast, the contractor is threatening to stop work." "I'm on my way," she replied briefly, grabbing her bag. At the construction site, there was chaos. Workers were huddled near the foreman's cabin. Shouts could be heard from inside. Jane walked purposefully toward the epicenter of the conflict. In the cabin, Andrew was trying to calm down a burly man in a hard hat. "Justin, let's talk calmly." "Calmly?" the contractor yelled. "We haven't been paid for 3 months, and I have people and materials." "Good afternoon," Jane said calmly as she entered. "I am the new CEO. Let's get this straightened out." Justin fell silent, looking at her with distrust, observing the elegant woman in the office suit. "And what is there to straighten out? According to the contract, the advances should be—" "Sit down." Jane pulled out her laptop. Let's review the documents together. An hour later, the situation was clear. The former financial director had intentionally held back payments, investing the money in dubious schemes. Jane immediately called the bank, and the funds were transferred to the contractor's account. That's how things are done, Justin said respectfully. Sorry for the shouting. The important thing is that construction must not stop, Jane replied. Andrew, prepare a new payment schedule and review all the contracts. There may be more surprises. Upon returning to the office, she called the financial director. He was nervous, getting tangled in his explanations, and then he admitted it. Yes, he had been moving the money around, hoping to make a profit from the interest. Write a letter of resignation, Jane said calmly. Do it correctly, or I'll turn the documents over to the prosecutor's office. An hour later, a letter of resignation was on her desk. An hour after that, Barbara called. What are you doing? Firing people who have worked with John for years. I'm firing those who are betraying the company, Jane replied curtly, and I advise you to withdraw your lawsuit. Don't embarrass yourself. In the evening, Mark stopped by the office. He had heard about the construction site. Well done, you handled it quickly. It was all quite simple, Jane shrugged. By the way, we need to review all the financial flows. Can you handle that? Of course. He hesitated for a moment. You know, I've been thinking, my father didn't do it for no reason. He wanted us to learn to work together as a team. Jane looked carefully at her ex-husband. Maybe, but only as a team, nothing personal. I understand, he replied in a low voice. And thank you for giving me a chance. A week passed. The company began to transform. Young professionals implemented new technologies, construction sites came to life, and a business-like atmosphere settled in the office. Jane stayed late reviewing documents. Someone knocked on the door. It was Nancy. Jane, you have a visitor. She says it's urgent. In the doorway appeared Brenda, her eyes tearful. I'm sorry to visit so late, but I have nowhere to go. What happened? Mark found out the truth. The baby isn't his. I lied to him. I thought it would be for the best. Jane poured water from a pitcher and offered it to the trembling girl. Tell me the story. It turned out to be a banal one. Brenda had fallen in love with a married man, got pregnant, and when he refused to leave his family, she decided to feign a romance with Mark, the rich heir who was going through a divorce. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she sobbed. I was just afraid of being alone with the baby. And now what? Mark kicked me out. He said he didn't want to see a liar. Jane sighed. So that's how this unpleasant story ended. Do you have a place to stay in the meantime? At a friend's place? Yes. Good. Jane took out her checkbook. This will help you get started. And a piece of advice. Start a new life without lies. The next morning, Mark didn't show up for work. He didn't answer calls or read messages. Jane felt she had to do something. After all, they weren't just exes, but also business partners. By lunchtime, she knew where to look for him, a small cafe in the old courtyard, their favourite spot during their college years. Mark was sitting at a table in the back, unkempt and unshaven. Can I sit down? She asked. He nodded silently. Jane ordered 2 coffees. You know, Mark finally said, I really wanted to fix everything. I thought this was the new life, family, a child, and it turned out to be another lie. How did your father find out? He had foreseen it. He simply knew how to see people, Jane replied, and he believed that everyone could change, even you. Do you think I'll make it? That's entirely up to you, but now is not the time to hide. There are important projects on the table, and the team is waiting for decisions. Mark raised his head. Do you really still trust me? I trust the professional you can become if you stop feeling sorry for yourself and start working. He finished his coffee and straightened up. Thank you for everything. I'll be in the office in an hour. Jane nodded. Something told her that this time Mark really would change. The days turned into weeks. The company was transforming before their eyes. New projects, modern technology, a young and energetic team. Everything John had dreamed of was coming to fruition. Mark immersed himself in his work, and his department began to show the best results. He himself seemed to have matured, becoming more serious and responsible. Barbara withdrew the lawsuit. Apparently, she realized how futile her attempt was. Now she occasionally appeared at the office, silently observing the changes that were taking place. One evening, she walked into Jane's office. "You know, I was wrong. John always knew how to see what was important in people, and he saw a true leader in you, too." Jane looked up from her papers. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." "I was thinking," Barbara said, sitting in a chair. "I have a lot of photos of John. A lot of photos from the beginning of the company, the first constructions. Maybe they'll be useful for the museum." "A museum?" Jane asked in surprise. "Yes. You wanted to create a museum about the company's history. It would be good for the young people to know how it all started." Jane smiled. In fact, that idea had been in John's plans, to create a museum, to show the company's journey from a small firm to a construction giant. "Of course, I'd be grateful. And will you stay on as an advisor? Your experience is invaluable." Tears welled up in her former mother-in-law's eyes. "Do you really want that?" "Of course. Family is the most important thing. John always said that." A month later, the company celebrated the completion of the Sun Coast project. The residential complex was delivered ahead of schedule, and all the apartments were sold. At the inauguration, the entire team was present. Jane stood on stage, looking out at the crowd, where those who believed in her were standing, those who helped make her father-in-law's dream a reality. "Today is a special day," she began. "We are not only delivering a new project, we have shown that together we can achieve it. Each of you has put a piece of your soul into this project." In the first row sat Barbara, furtively wiping away tears. Next to her was Mark, well-dressed and confident, nothing like the lost man in the cafe. "I want to announce," Jane continued, "that this complex will be named after John, the person who taught us the most important thing, to believe in people." After the ceremony, Mark approached Jane. "Excellent presentation, and overall, everything was great." "Thank you. You did well too. The project with the contractors exceeded expectations." "You know, I've been thinking," he hesitated for a moment, "maybe we could have lunch sometime, just as partners to discuss new ideas." Jane shook her head. "That's not necessary, Mark. We work well together. Let's not complicate things." "I understand," he said with a sad smile. "You're right, as always." "Not as always. Only now am I right." She watched her ex-husband walk away and thought about how strange life is sometimes. You have to lose everything to find yourself. Late that night, Jane returned to her father's office. She sat in his chair and took out an old photo, the same one from the corporate event. They were both smiling happily, unaware of what awaited them. "You know, Dad," she said in a low voice, "you were right. You were right about everything. I did it. We did it." The phone on the table rang. A new project, new tasks, new challenges. Life went on, and outside the window, the night city spread before her. Thousands of lights, dozens of constructions, hundreds of plans for the future. Her city, her city. Steps were heard in the reception area. Nancy came in with the evening mail. "Jane, here's a proposal from foreign partners, and the sketches for the museum are ready too." "Great," Jane put the photo down. "Let's take a look." The next day, the board of directors gathered in the conference room. Jane presented the new development strategy, ambitious but realistic. International projects, innovative technologies, social programs. "We are not just a construction company," she said. "We are creating the future. And we are doing it together." She looked at those present. Young professionals with bright eyes, experienced leaders with their invaluable knowledge, Mark with his new attitude toward work, Barbara, who had become a wise advisor. The team, the family, the legacy of John. The Company History Museum opened 2 months later, a small cozy room on the first floor of the main office. The walls were decorated with photographs, the first constructions, important moments, people who made history. In the center was a large portrait of John. His kind eyes seemed to watch everything that was happening, and his slight smile said, "Everything's going well." Jane often came here in the evenings to look at the old photos, read the documents, and remember. Here she felt a special connection with the person who had believed in her more than she had herself. One day, Barbara caught her in the act. "You like coming here?" "Yes," Jane replied. "It has a special atmosphere, as if Dad is nearby." Her former mother-in-law sat down next to her. "You know, John talked about you a lot, especially in the last year. He kept repeating, 'Jane will do it. She has the right character, strong but flexible.'" "And you didn't believe it?" "I didn't," Barbara admitted. "I thought he was supporting you out of pity. And it turned out he saw what all of us didn't." They sat in silence, looking at the photos. So many stories, so many lives. "By the way," Barbara hurried to say, "I found another album, the company's very first project, a 5-story building on the outskirts. John was so proud of it." "Show me," Jane said, brightening up. Together they leaned over the worn album, and a young man stood in front of the building under construction, happy, confident in his dream. "I remember this story," Barbara smiled. "There wasn't enough money. The workers wanted to leave. John spent the whole night talking to them, convincing everyone to believe in the project. And in the end, they believed." "He knew how to convince them," Jane nodded, "because he himself believed." "How are you doing now?" her former mother-in-law said in a low voice. The same inflections, the same look. Jane felt a lump form in her throat. So many years had passed, but the memory of her father-in-law did not fade. It only grew brighter. At the museum door, Mark appeared. "There you are. A delegation has arrived, new partners from another city." "I'm coming," Jane stood up. "Barbara, thank you for the album. We'll add it to the exhibition." "Wait," her former mother-in-law called out. "There's something important on the last page." Jane opened the album. On the last photo was the first building, already finished, and underneath a handwritten inscription by John. "The important thing is not the walls, but the people. The walls will fall, but the people will remain. Believe in them, and they will move mountains." "He was always right," Jane whispered. "It's all about the people." Voices were heard on the other side of the door. The company was growing, developing, attracting new partners. "It's time," Barbara smiled. "Go, my girl. You're achieving everything just as John wanted." Jane nodded and walked toward the exit. She turned back before leaving. The portrait of her father-in-law seemed to shine in the rays of the setting sun. It seemed to her that he was winking at her, as he always did when he sent her to important negotiations. "I won't fail you," she said with her lips. In the conference room, the guests were waiting, the directors of a large company interested in joint projects. Jane looked at her team, Mark with a folder of documents, the young professionals with their presentation, the experienced department heads. "Good afternoon, colleagues," she began. "I'm pleased to welcome you to the company." She spoke with confidence and calm, presenting the team, talking about the projects, and she saw how the eyes of the guests lit up. They felt that special atmosphere that made the company unique, an atmosphere of trust, professionalism, and faith in a common cause. John's legacy multiplied by new energy. After the meeting, Mark stayed a little longer. "Everything went very well. They are clearly impressed." "Yes," Jane nodded. "The most important thing now is not to disappoint their expectations." "We won't disappoint them," he said confidently. "We have the best team." Jane looked at her ex-husband, how he had changed in these months. The arrogance had disappeared, and now there was the genuine confidence of a true professional. "You know," Mark said suddenly, "I want to apologize for everything. I was foolish, selfish." "There's no need," Jane interrupted softly. "The past is in the past. What matters now is something else. We've learned to work together, and that's the most important thing." Late that night, Jane again went to the museum. She sat on the bench in front of her father-in-law's portrait and took out his last letter. "I'm proud of you, my girl. You have managed to preserve the most important thing, the ability to believe in people despite everything. This quality is what makes a true leader. I know it won't be easy. Mark and Barbara won't understand it right away, but you'll get through it. Because behind you is the truth, and the truth always wins. Outside the window, the evening shadows lengthened. The city turned on its lights, and dozens of new buildings shone in the darkness with warm windows. Someone knocked softly on the door. It was Nancy. "Jane, sorry to bother you. The young professionals asked for 5 minutes. They say they have an interesting idea." "Let them in," Jane smiled, putting away the letter. Patrick and his team entered the museum, their eyes shining. "Jane, we've had an idea. We can create a virtual tour of all the company's projects, from the very first 5-story building to the most recent projects. And," Christina continued, "add stories from the old workers. We have so much interesting material." Jane looked at their enthusiastic faces and thought, there it is, the future of the company, young talents, full of ideas. "That's an excellent idea," she said. "Prepare the project, but add something else." "What exactly?" "Stories about the people, about those who built these buildings, about the families who live in them, about the children who grew up in our courtyards." Patrick was writing quickly. "Exactly! That's the most important thing. Not just the building, but the story of life." "Exactly," Jane nodded. "John always said, we don't build walls, we build destinies." The young people rushed to share ideas, and Jane looked at her father-in-law's portrait and saw him smiling in approval. Jane returned home late. She was tired, but her soul was calm and joyful. So much had happened in these months, and everything had fallen into place just as it should have. She walked to the window. The city stretched out before her like a sea of lights. Somewhere, new residents were already settling into apartments on the Sun Coast. Young families were walking through the newly landscaped courtyards, and children were playing in the parks. The phone rang softly, a message from Barbara. "I've found more albums. Come over for tea tomorrow and we can look at them together." Jane smiled. Who would have thought that she and her former mother-in-law would become almost friends? Life truly is full of surprises. On the table was the unfinished report, the company's development plans for the next year. Jane sat down and scanned the last lines. Everything checked out, the numbers, the deadlines, the prospects. But the most important thing wasn't in that. The most important thing was that people had believed in themselves, in the company, in the future. "Thank you, Dad," she thought, "for the lesson, for the trust, for the wisdom." Tomorrow would be a new day, with new tasks, new projects, and new heights to reach. But now she knew for sure that she would succeed, because she was accompanied by a team, because she had a goal, because she believed in people. Something gleamed in the folder with the documents. Jane pulled out an old photograph, her and John, both in hard hats, smiling. A new building was rising behind them. On the back was a handwritten inscription, "For my girl, keep building the future." Jane hugged the photo to her chest. Warm